This episode of Arrays of Living is titled An Accessible World, and we're here with a guest. And you all know how much I love my guest episodes. So we have Linda Hunt joining us, and we have so much to talk about related to accessibility. But first, let Linda introduce herself. Linda, over to you. Welcome to the show. It's a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Jen. So as by way of introduction, I'm an award-winning accessibility consultant, speaker, podcaster, and author. I'm the CEO of a company called Accessibility Solutions, and we work with businesses to remedy barriers for persons with disabilities. So one of my, or we'll call it our mission statement, is making the world accessible. And so what fits in with your topic today is an accessible world, because our mission is making the world accessible.
And I'm glad you started with that, because my first question is, what is an accessible world? And I'm deliberately asking that because we already know there's some people that truly do not understand the full struggles of lack of accessibility. So what is an accessible world? Because many will look at you and say the world is already accessible. So how would you explain what an accessible world is?
Well, really, it's just everyone can go everywhere. There are no barriers to anyone, and we have if you don't have a disability, you could have one. You could have one tomorrow. You could be in a catastrophic car accident on your way home from work today and find that you're a person with a disability tomorrow. So the incidence of disability is 22% of the population has a disability now. And for the population over the age of 65, the baby boomers,
Mhm.
that percentage actually increases to 40% of the population.
Wow.
So, yeah, so there is a real business case for
Mhm.
why all businesses and organizations should be accessible. And that's because the incidence of disability increases as the population ages. If you are not accessible, then that's between 25 and 40% of the population that are not going to come to your business. They're not going to use your services because you're not accessible. And that's that's those are real numbers. Those are
And
real.
that's what I love, the fact that you're using numbers, because numbers speak for themselves. Now, in your mind, is accessibility all about mobility?
Accessibility is anything. It is just ensuring that there are no barriers to anyone that wants to access a business or a service. So, I myself am in a power wheelchair. Mobility barriers are usually what people think about when they talk about accessibility. But it doesn't matter if someone is blind, or if they're deaf, or if they have an intellectual disability, or a mental health disability, a learning disability, anything like that. Is those are all, recognizable disabilities, people that need to have access. Yeah.
Let me ask you this, because I think it could be a bit sensitive. When do you use disability and when do you use accessibility? Because we have an accessibility act, and then there seems to be a sensitivity to using the word disability or disable. So what is the proper, in your mind, the proper language that able body that don't fall into that label and grouping? And if you know me, I hate labels. I really do. But if you fall into that, what is the proper language? Because I see a lot of times, especially in the corporate setting, people don't know necessarily what to say, how to say it. So maybe you can give some insights to that.
Yeah, so in I'm in Canada, but in the United
Okay.
States, you're actually further ahead of us. You've had the Americans with Disabilities Act since 1992, so it was just 30 years old last year. And I do travel a lot, so I will tell you from the standpoint of accessibility, which to me, accessibility is the environment. And so if you can think of the environment just being accessible for everyone. Persons with disabilities is identifying a person. So I use a power wheelchair. I'm a person with a disability, or in some cases that would be referred to as I'm disabled.
Mhm.
And then we have handicap, and people will use that word, but the handicap is really the fact that there's a barrier
Mhm.
for a person with a disability to them being able to access something. So the handicap is not actually attached to the person with a disability. It is something in the environment that is a barrier.
Okay, I see. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you ask the question, what is accessibility? Accessibility is the environment. And, as I said before, our mission of making the world accessible
Mhm.
just means that there are no barriers to anyone with a disability anywhere in the world.
So in your mind, it would not be offensive then to say something like, Linda's my friend and she is disabled. That is okay. That would not
Yes.
offend.
No,
Okay.
because
And that's what I
it,
want people to know how they should refer to people with disability, even in their presence, so they're not offensive
yes.
or they're not
And,
offended.
and that's no different as than saying Jen has black hair, or Jen wears glasses. Well,
Mhm.
Jen wears glasses. In some cases, the fact that you wear glasses means that you have a visual disability. If you
Exactly.
if you if you weren't wearing glasses, you might be wearing contacts.
Ex-
But in that case, your glasses are an aid for your disability.
And do you mind talking about 2004 and how because you went from from being able to being disabled in 2004. Do you mind telling that story?
Sure, sure. So just to give you a little background, I was actually diagnosed in 1998, so 25 years ago,
Hmm.
with multiple sclerosis,
Ah, okay.
which is a chronic disease and has different trajectories of disability progression. So in 2004, after living with the disease for 6 years, my disability progressed to the point that in 2004, I had a limp and I started walking with one cane. And
Mm.
then I went from early 2006 to the end of 2007, from one cane to two canes to a walker to a scooter to a wheelchair, in the span of about 18 months.
Wow.
So I really had a very, very short time frame of disability progression,
Mm.
and all through that time, had to adapt to the environment, which, in Canada,
Was not
are
good at that time.
no, we are. I'm in the province of Ontario, so
Mhm.
we actually had legislation that was introduced in 2005
Mhm.
that was designed to make the province of Ontario fully accessible by 2025. And I'll tell you, it's 2023, and we've got a long, long way to go. We're not
And I want
even.
to spend some time talking about that because even in some work that I do, and I can't really, with the government, we are looking at the Accessibility Act as it even pertains to advancement of technology and how to keep it abreast to be able to service those with disabilities in the proper way and trying to understand that. So it's been in my focus for the past month or more in terms of lack. So I want to spend a little time to talk about where you see the lack from two perspectives, the environment and then technology. So let's first talk about the environment. Where do you still see there needs to be a lot of work still done?
Yeah, so we refer to that as the built environment, which is, so think of buildings.
Yep.
Um, and some of the biggest challenges are, the fact that building codes have not kept up with what the real needs are for persons with disabilities. So in the province of Ontario, for example, the Ontario Building Code says now if you're building a new building or you're doing a major renovation, then you have to meet accessibility requirements. But what the real issue is in reality is that there are so many buildings and businesses, prior to those,
Yeah.
right? So then you've got the cost of
Retrofit.
retrofitting,
Yeah.
and retrofitting is where things get expensive. But when you think about building a new building, and we could have been thinking along these lines 20, 30, 40 years ago. It doesn't cost anymore to build a building that's accessible. It's the renovations or the retrofitting that's
Mhm.
expensive.
You're now on a council, right? You're now an official counselor.
Yeah,
So does that mean now that you have more clout to really lobby for some of these changes?
I would like to think so. Let's put it this way. I certainly bring the voice, persons with disabilities, to the table. I'm a municipal councilor, so for my city, but also encouraging us to be looking at making decisions with that accessibility lens so that we're not, I always say, we're not using public tax dollars to build something that has a barrier to persons with disabilities. That's an example of ensuring that accessibility is considered from the design or the planning stage of specifically a municipal building, because we're talking about something that's in the planning and design, might be in a capital budget, for example,
Right.
and then having the municipal council be aware that we need to consider accessibility when we're looking at that particular project.
So now where do you see the lack related to technology?
Technology, I think, and we certainly have legislation around, and it's a similar concept. New and redeveloped websites must meet certain levels of accessibility technology,
Mm.
but it's the same thing. It's a grandfathered website, so websites that have been around for 5 or 10 years don't have that same requirement. And so from a technology perspective, persons with who are blind or have low vision.
And I never understand. This is one of the things that I always shake my head about. I remember when I was in university, I had a professor and he talked about the future value of money. And at that time, in our youth and our ignorance, at that time, I thought, what a dry topic. I hate this topic and everything. As I grew up and went into the real world and started thinking, I was like, oh my God, that was like the most important part of the education because we're living that. And when you think about 2004, 2005, when they could have actually brought in and do these things at that cost then and what it would cost now, you think, why didn't they do it back then? I don't get it.
I know.
Every time they delay, the more it's going to cost to do it, and the more the excuses are going to be that it's costly. You know what I mean? It's like I feel like it's a never ending cycle of excuses as opposed to can we just get something concrete in place? So I ask, what keeps you resilient to this? What keeps you going in the face of some of the only way I can call it nonsensical actions that get taken place and how slow it is to actually make progress? What keeps you resilient, Linda?
I think what keeps me resilient is the fact that there are, I mean, I have clients, I work with businesses every day that are getting the message that
Oh, okay.
accessibility is good for business. And I mean, it started out, and I'm sure it started out probably 30 years ago in the US with the ADA comes along. Now it's legislation. And a
Hmm.
lot of businesses look at legislation as that's something I have to do.
Hmm.
Whereas now, when we really look at the real numbers, the percentage of people with a disability and how that is going to negatively impact your bottom line if you're not accessible, then businesses are not just doing it because it's something they have to do.
Hmm.
They recognize the value in being accessible. The other thing that we work with a lot of businesses on is inclusive hiring strategies,
Right.
because the world is short staffed and the most underutilized labor pool of people out there are persons with disabilities. And training businesses to understand the value of inclusive hiring strategies really we've got, I don't know about where you are, but where we are, we've got businesses that aren't even able to open their regular hours. Yeah, they can't staff their facility. And so that's really impacting their bottom line. I mean,
Mhm.
if your business bottom line is based on being open 7 days a week, but now you only have enough staff to be open four, then embracing inclusive hiring strategies to bring persons with disabilities into your organization, that's money.
That also then hits them, depending on where they are, that they've still got to look at the environment to make that happen as well. So the two go hand in hand, is all I'm saying as
Yeah,
well.
and that's what the inclusive hiring strategies are all about. Like, first of all, the biggest barrier to
Mhm.
hiring persons with disabilities is usually attitudinal barriers. People have to get past that and see that persons with disabilities bring just as much to the table.
The inclusion thing always irks me because, as you can see, I'm a what would be called a visible minority. Plus, I'm a female, so I've got it
Yeah.
double side. Inclusion is a human right. This space called Earth is big enough to hold all of us. And we have to just embrace everybody, irrespective of what lived experiences they have and what skin they were handed when they were born. We got to look at each other as humans first. And if we started doing that from our own individual space, I think you would see the heart expand and the connection expand to start looking at these things in a much more fulsome way. Like, I don't look at you, Linda, and see a disabled person. I need you to understand that. Look at you and I see a wonderful lady, a vibrant lady, a very committed lady in front of me. That's what I see. If you didn't tell me you were in a wheelchair, I honestly wouldn't have seen it. Even if I saw you in person, you'd get the same level of respect. And I think we have to start understanding, that we're all just humans. We bleed the same way. We have the same desires, the same Maslow basic needs. There was a question that I had for you in terms of trying to get more people in. Here's the question that I had. I had a little bit of a brain burp there for a minute. I'll be honest about that. One of the things I find interesting is we have privacy regulation and we have a privacy police called the IPC, or a body that overlooks privacy matters. In the same way with the accessibility acts and regulations, is there an accessibility body or police that goes around and says this needs to change? Is there such a thing for accessibility?
So we do have here, and it's funny that you mentioned human rights. So in Ontario, where I am, it's called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act. So that legislation is companion legislation to the Ontario Human Rights Code. So violations of the what we call the AODA can be reported to the Ontario Human Rights Code as a human rights violation because I have just as much right to access whatever goods and services as anyone else does.
Exactly.
So that's what we call the stick.
Mhm. And as a counselor, one of the things I would present to you, I don't know if it's already in place, but something certainly that came into my mind was, do we have a sense of where the density of people lacking accessibility or having a disability, do we have a sense of density pockets that could prioritize where the focus go and where the funding goes to kind of equalize those areas a little bit more and then go, you know what I mean, as a method of prioritization? What do you think of something like that?
Yeah, when I look at my mission of just making the world
Yeah,
accessible, I think everything should be accessible for
agree.
everyone,
But you got to
every
start somewhere, right?
everywhere. Yeah,
I'm a
that's an interesting concept.
I'm a
Uh,
strategist, so I look at, we could try to get the big bang, right? But with technology and stats the way they are, if we can start and say this pocket of Ontario for some reason has a high presence of disabled, let's start with that or use that as a pilot to show the benefits of how that region can prosper because we put dollars into it to really make it accessible because it shows a really high density population. Might be a way to start.
I realize what you're saying. I
Yeah.
can't fix everything all at once. I guess my argument with that is we shouldn't have to fix it at all. It it should have been accessible to start with.
And I don't mean to, but I agree. Don't
Yeah.
make sure you understand, Linda. I 150, 250% agree with you. But sometimes when you're herding the cattle,
Yeah.
you have to have a strategy and approach to do it. It's just a suggestion from old layman me thinking it you start with a pilot that proves success and then you go from there and it might be a way to reel in. Just a thought. I just put it up.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, I'm fairly new to city council. My biggest thing is that we don't use any tax dollars to build barriers. So anything that we're approving that's going to be a new build
Mhm.
does not have any barriers in. That's the message. Because if we had started thinking along those lines 20 or 30 years ago, just think of all the
Oh yeah.
buildings and projects that, we wouldn't even be talking about renovating at this point because they would have been accessible when they were built 20 or 30 years ago. So
So it
that's,
might be a two-prong approach, right? Where you deal with the new ones come starting out and deal with that upfront, and then the retrofits, you go back using the other approach. But just
yeah,
some thoughts as I was going through. I wanted to wrap up with rapid fire. I've been doing rapid fire to wrap up, and I'm going to throw you some words, and you just tell me what comes to mind. And one of them is very unique to you. So all the podcasters have a unique word. So the first one I think is mindset. What comes to mind?
for me, it's a positive mindset. As a person with a disability, I speak quite often on the power of a positive mindset when you're dealing with
Love
adversity.
it, love it. Gratitude.
Be
Just
just be thankful for the gifts that you have in your life.
now this one's gonna throw you off. Wowsy.
Wowsy.
Wowsy. What comes to mind?
I don't know.
You
Potapalooza. This
smiled.
is
You had a big smile, so I know it.
yeah. I think for me, yeah, more doors that are opening. Just
Awesome.
the more the message is getting through and people are getting it.
Okay.
That's when I get the wow factor. It's like, yeah,
And here's the one unique to you. I couldn't finish all the words because we ran out of time, so I'll have to track time a little better. But anyway, advocate. This one is definitely unique to you. Advocate. What comes to mind?
that's just speaking up and speaking out. And also for me, I do a lot of advocacy work because there are a lot of people in my situation who have a disability that are not able to advocate for themselves. And so the more people that are able to advocate, then the more the word gets
Exactly.
around.
And I love the word. It's such a powerful word. I used to call myself a life advocate, and I still am, but I turned it to strategy as to how to get around barriers. So it fitted right in. Linda, thank you so much for being on the show. Is there any last things you want the audience to know, where to find you, anything like that?
I give my email address. I say, reach out if you've got questions or comments. And I always say, if I don't know the answer, I might know somebody that does. So my email address is Linda at solutions, the number 4 accessibility.com. And I'm sure you'll put that in the show notes.
Yes, I will. Thank you so much. And this wraps up another edition of Arrays of Living with our guest, Linda Hunt. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for listening to this episode of Arrays of Living. And please be sure to follow me on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You will also find in the description below my email address should you want to reach out, and I am happy if you do. And just to be sure, it's jen@youareworthmore.co, and worth more you definitely are. And lastly, also see the link that will allow you to schedule a meet and greet with me. And that's an opportunity for me to meet you and you to meet me and for us to have a chat. And that would be wonderful and welcoming. So please hit the link and let's set up a meet and greet.